I think Russia is under Putin is in an aggressive and resurgent stage. I think it was a great mistake not to enforce a no-fly zone over Syria, because that has emboldened Putin to move aggressively against Ukraine. So I think we're seeing a kind of very aggressive, resurgent Russian foreign policy, and I do feel that that is a threat to Europe.
Yeah. Right now?
No. It used to be a superpower, but even then I think it was a fake superpower, because I don't think that they had the kind of weaponry and resources to support being a superpower.
Yeah.
That I think they were a very strong nation at one point, and they emerged from a period of backwardness, I would say, under Peter the Great, when they began to take over. They began to become a major power. I feel, this is all my personal opinion, maybe not backed up by lots of knowledge in reading, so you'll have to forgive me. They, however, were dragged down by their lack of social progression under the Tsars. So they still had serfdom. They had huge differences between the wealthy and the poor. It was almost like they were two different nations, the poor people and the very, very wealthy. The very wealthy elite looked to France, Western Europe. They were slowly industrialising under Tsar Nicholas II when he was overthrown. So it's possible, had he not been overthrown, that things would be different, or indeed if the first revolutionaries who overthrew him had been allowed to take power before they were in their turn overthrown by the communists. And it was under Lenin and then Stalin that Russia, because of its brutalization of its population and the idea of it being a dictatorship, they were able to trample over the rights of the people and therefore build up the power to spend all that money on their army and the weaponry.
I think it's an extremely strong country that exerts its power for good, but sometimes for not so good reasons. I think that it's very strong militarily, although now its economy is somewhat sluggish. Yes, Russia is one of the strongest powers, but, well, not economically to an extent, but militarily it's certainly one of the strongest powers in the world. Well, historically, I mean, they were a great power during the Tsars. And then with the coming of the Soviet Union, I think they were able to industrialize to an extent that allowed them to compete in the world, both militarily and economically.
Russia, one of the strongest and effective countries in the world, wasn't always great. They went through a lot of national trials which helped Russia to become modernized. So, let's begin with Russian Empire. In 1790s, Russia under Empress Catherine began to abandon the feudalist institution. By the time the regions in Moscow became enlightened, the passage around the Volga and Yekaterinburg were still served using the feudalist system. Since Russians began to modernize, one of the biggest problems for them was the size of the country. So by 1905, the Russian forces issued an ultimatum to Japan demanding Manchuria, and in response, Japan invaded Russia. About a year after the war began, the Japanese forces obliterated the Russian troops, causing a severe damage to Russia and Tsar Nicholas II's reputation. And this war was the first time that European power lost to an Asian nation. By World War I, Russian industry became too weak and poor that they couldn't sustain the army with enough equipment. which ultimately causing them to be completely obliterated by the Germans. Due to these wars, there was a widespread of discontent among the peasants of Russia about losing their jobs, money, and family. This dissatisfaction led to proletarian revolt against their government, which eventually formed the Soviet Union, and later on the Russian Civil War began. Years after the Russian Civil War, the Russian Empire collapsed because of its weak industry. However, the Enlightenment move has slowly started throughout the Russia. Before World War II, Stalin realized that the Soviets' industry capability is much bigger than German, American, or even Japanese industry. Thus, he led a series of economic and industrial reform, and during the process of reform, it caused the death of 32 million people, mainly in the Kievan Rus region. Those reforms were the stepping stone for the Soviet Union to become the next superpower alongside the US. Soviet was going through this suicidal tactic, but they did manage to make it work and finally modernize economically. After the World War II, the Soviets' industrial capability has tremendously progressed, and now they are able to sustain their army of over 33 million men without any lend-leases, meaning that they obtained the industrial and military capability that could threaten the power of US. After Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev, an avid supporter of Soviet space program, succeeded Stalin as the chairman of the Communist Party. She helped the progression of launching the first ever space cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, into space. As a result, for the first time, the Soviet Union has surpassed the US technologically. Under Brezhnev's control, the Soviet industry reached the point where the government could no longer economically sustain it, so they had to begin taking loans. The Soviet economy went into recession due to the fact that their army maintenance and industrial focus was too expensive to sustain. The Russian army needed more land and industry, so Brezhnev decided to invade Afghanistan for its riches and minimal industry. The next chairman of the Soviet Union, Yuri Andropov, decided to cancel all space missions of the country in an effort to regrow the economy. All these efforts made the nowadays modernized Russia. So let's talk about positive and negative effects. After the modernization, they became the country with the second strongest military, sixth largest economy, and second biggest oil producer. Due to the active trade, they have strengthened the relationship, especially with China and the East. They are effective enough to reject the UN's decision even if the rest of the country support. The industrial development in the time of Russian Empire and the Soviet Union created a monster that can't stop growing. As we can see, Russia achieved a lot of things by going through these hard works. However, they aren't always have the benefits through the big changes. Russia has a very high amount of corruption due to the oligarchies who mostly controls the country. This problem puts a big gap between the wealthy elites and the middle class people and helping the high class to become richer exclusively. Russia went from one of the most religiously conservative countries in Europe to one of the richest, yet one of the most corrupted countries in the world. Thank you.